I want you to picture a scene. It's dusty, it's hot, and you're standing in the district of Caesarea Philippi.
Okay.
You're surrounded by these ancient ruins, temples to pagan gods, the whole heavy atmosphere of history. And there's this man you've been following for months.
Right.
You've seen him eat, sleep, laugh, maybe even, I don't know, trip over a stone. And he turns to you and drops the single most explosive question in the history of the world. Who do you say that I am?
It really is the ultimate question, Matthew 16.15. And it's deceptive because it sounds so simple, right? It sounds like a personal opinion poll.
So what's your take?
Exactly. But in Latin theology, this question is known as the articulus stantis accadentis ecclesiae, which is just a fancy way of saying it's the article upon which the church stands or falls.
Stands or falls.
Everything. And I mean everything. Your worldview, your understanding of history, the very logic of salvation, it all hinges on the grammar of your answer.
See, that's where I get stuck sometimes. I get that it's important spiritually, of course, but we are looking at a stack of research today that claims this one question was the subject of a ferocious intellectual cage match for, the first 5 centuries of history?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, actual riots in the streets over Greek verbs. Why were the stakes so high? It feels like from a modern perspective, we just say, hey, let's agree to disagree and go grab lunch.
And that is exactly the modern temptation, to treat this as a matter of personal preference, of private piety. But the source material we are deep diving into today, which is titled The Chalcedonian Defence, argues that the early church realized something terrifying.
Which was?
That if they got the math wrong and who Jesus was, the entire bridge between God and humanity would collapse. It wasn't just about winning an argument. It was about, and this sounds grand, but it was about the logical consistency of the universe.
So our mission today is to unpack this Chalcedonian defense. We are analyzing a critical breakdown of how modern views on Jesus, and there are a lot of them, measure up against an ancient council from 451 AD, the Council of Chalcedon.
451 AD. This is the moment the church drew a line in the sand. Or maybe a better analogy is they built a fence.
A fence. I like that. But here is the tension, and this is what I really want to push on today. We live in a world that values relatability. We want a Jesus who makes sense to our modern scientific brains, or maybe to our political ambitions.
Sure.
The argument in our sources is that when modern theology tries to jump over these ancient fences to make Jesus relatable, we don't end up with a better Jesus. We get a broken one. But frankly, I need to be convinced that a meeting from 1,500 years ago has anything to say to someone stuck in traffic in the 21st century.
That is a completely fair skepticism. Why should we care about ancient metaphysics? Here is the hook. Chalcedon doesn't claim to explain the mystery. It defines the grammar of reality.
The grammar of reality.
And if you ignore that grammar, you end up with a savior who is either too weak to save you, too distant to hear you, or too schizophrenic to function. Chalcedon was the emergency response to a crisis. The church was navigating between two monsters, Scylla and Charybdis.
Okay, let's get into the cage match then. Who are the monsters? And don't just give me the names, give me the logic. Why were these views so dangerous that they needed a global council to stop them?
Well, the first monster was Nestorianism. It's named after Nestorius, who was the Patriarch of Constantinople, a very important guy.
Okay.
Now, you have to understand, Nestorius wasn't, trying to be a heretic. He really wasn't. He was trying to protect the dignity of God. He looked at the popular piety of the day where people were calling Mary Theotokos,
Mother of God.
the God-bearer. And that rubbed him the wrong way. It scandalized him. He thought, wait a minute, God is the eternal, the creator. God cannot be born. God cannot wear diapers. God cannot bleed. It just seemed insulting, to the divine nature.
Sounds kind of logical, actually. It protects God's transcendence.
It does. It's a very neat solution. So to solve this messiness, Nestorius effectively cut Christ in two.
In two? You mean like physically?
No, metaphysically. Yeah. He proposed that there were two persons. You had the divine logos, the word, and then you had the man Jesus. And they were linked, like a partnership.
So not one person?
Not one person. He called it a moral union or a conjunction. The image he used was two boards glued together. They're very close. They act together, but they're fundamentally two different things.
So, in his view, when Mary gives birth, the baby in the manger is just a human baby, and God is, hovering nearby.
Closely associated. Indwelling the man, perhaps, but distinct. And here's the crucial point. For Nestorius, when Jesus died on the cross, God did not die. The man Jesus died. God was just watching.
I can see why that's logically safer, right? It avoids the paradox of an immortal God dying. But if only the man died, then it's just a human sacrifice, isn't it?
That is exactly it. And that is why it's a monster. If only a man died, then the debt of sin, which is infinite because it's against an infinite God, isn't paid. A finite human death can't bridge the gap to the divine.
So if you separate the natures into two persons, you lose the atonement.
You lose the atonement. The whole project fails.
Okay, so that's monster number one. Separation. Too much distance. What's the reaction to that? Because there's always a reaction.
The reaction was Eutychianism, named after a monk named Eutyches. He looked at Nestorius and said, "That's terrible. We must protect the unity of Christ." But he panicked. He ran too far in the opposite direction.
And what does he teach?
He taught that in the incarnation, the human nature was completely absorbed by the divine.
Absorbed, like assimilated.
Yes.
Yeah.
His famous analogy was like a drop of honey in the ocean. If you take a teaspoon of honey, that's humanity, and you drop it into the Atlantic Ocean, that's divinity. What happens to the honey?
It dissolves. It's gone. It just becomes ocean.
Precisely. Eutyches argued that after the incarnation, there was only one nature, a single divine nature. The humanity was so overwhelmed by God's glory that it ceased to exist as distinct humanity. This is called monophysitism, from the Greek for one nature.
But hang on. If he's not human, then he's just God in a costume. He's not really one of us.
Correct. And that is the other monster. If he isn't truly human, he can't represent us. As one of the early church fathers, Gregory of Nazianzus, famously said, "That which he has not assumed, he has not healed."
If he didn't take on real permanent human nature, then our human nature isn't saved.
Exactly. You lose the other side of the bridge.
So Chalcedon is the referee stepping in between two-person Jesus on one side and no humanity Jesus on the other.
And the brilliance of the council in 451 is that they didn't try to explain how the mechanics work. They knew it was a mystery beyond human comprehension. Instead, they built a perimeter. They produced the Chalcedonian Definition. And it states very carefully that there is one person, hypostasis, acknowledged in two natures, physes, truly God and truly man.
And this is where we get those four famous negatives, right? The fences.
Yes. The four guardrails. There are four Greek adverbs that define the boundaries of the mystery by saying what it is not. And these are crucial because, as we'll see, every modern deviation we're going to talk about crashes headlong into one of these four walls.
All right, let's walk the perimeter. Tell me about fence number one.
Fence number one is a syncatus. It means without confusion.
Without confusion.
This is the anti-Eutyches fence. It means the divine and human natures do not blend or mix into some kind of third substance. It's not a chemical reaction where you mix blue and yellow to get green. God remains fully God. Man remains fully man. There's no demigod hybrid.
So no smoothie Jesus. Got it. What about fence number two?
Atreptus. This means without change.
Without change.
This one refutes the idea that God had to mutate into flesh. The divine word didn't stop being God in order to become man. He didn't lose his attributes. He didn't shed his divinity. The divine nature is immutable. It cannot change.
Which seems impossible, but okay. We'll get to how that works. Fence number three.
Adiurichis. Without division. This one is aimed squarely at Nestorius.
Right.
You cannot split Jesus into two subjects. There isn't a Jesus and a Christ. There isn't a human side that does the sleeking and a God side that does the miracles. There is just one person doing everything.
Okay, that's clear. And the last fence.
Atrustus. Without separation. This means the union of the two natures is permanent. It can never, ever be dissolved, not in death, not in the resurrection, not in eternity. He is the God-man forever.
Without confusion, without change, without division, without separation. It sounds like a legal contract, almost. But before we test these fences against the modern stuff, we really need to clarify a piece of jargon that the source material obsesses over. The difference between hypostasis and physis.
This is the absolute engine room. If you get this distinction, you get everything. Physis, or nature, refers to what something is. It's the set of attributes, the faculties, the potential. You and I have a human nature. We have a body, a mind, a will. God has a divine nature, omnipotence, omniscience, eternity.
Okay, what something is. And hypostasis.
Anastasis is the person. It refers to who the subject is. It is the I, the acting subject, the personal ego.
So I am one person, a single hypostasis with one nature, a human physis.
Correct. But the claim of Chalcedon is utterly unique. Jesus is one person, the eternal Word, who possesses two natures. He operates through the machinery of divinity and the machinery of humanity simultaneously.
The source mentions a term that sounds like a medical condition, anhypostasia. Can we break that down without putting everyone to sleep?
It's actually a thrilling concept if you think about it, really. And hypostasia means no personhood. It posits that the human nature of Jesus, the body and soul born of Mary, never existed for a single microsecond as an independent guy named Jesus.
So there was never a moment where he was just a regular human fetus and then God sort of jumped in.
Never. The human nature is like a suit of clothes that has no shape until it is worn. Or maybe a better way to think of it is this. The human nature has no ego of its own. It receives its existence, its personhood, in the person of the Word. This is called anhypostasia in person.
Why does that tiny distinction matter so much?
Because if the human nature had its own I, its own personhood, then you're right back to Nestorianism. You'd have two people, the Word and the man. This doctrine ensures that the who walking around Galilee is God himself living a genuine human life.
Okay, that's the control group. That's the fortress of Chalcedon. Now let's bring in the battering rams. This is where the source material gets spicy because it argues that the modern church, and I mean both liberals and evangelicals, have been trying to dismantle these fences because they feel, I don't know, restrictive.
They feel restrictive, and we crave relatability. We want a Jesus who is like us in every way, not just in body, but in limitation, in ignorance.
This brings us straight to the Kenotic Deviation. This is huge right now. You hear it everywhere. It comes from Philippians 2.7, where Paul says Jesus emptied himself. The Greek word is kenosis.
Right. And the modern interpretation, which really took off in the 19th century, says this. For God to truly become human, he had to divest himself of his omni-attributes, his omniscience, his omnipotence.
And honestly, I get the appeal. I really do. If Jesus is lying in the manger, cooing at Mary, but secretly he's calculating the trajectory of comets and upholding the strong nuclear force, it feels fake.
It does feel fake.
It feels like he's play acting, like he's Clark Kent pretending to be clumsy. To be human is to be limited. So the argument goes, he must have turned off his omniscience to fit into a human brain.
That is the kenotic argument in a nutshell. It saves the psychological realism of Jesus. But the source material argues that while this feels nice, it crashes headlong into that second fence, a treptis without change, and in doing so, it creates a metaphysical disaster.
Okay, why is it a disaster? If God wants to limit himself, can't he? I mean, he's God.
It's not about what he can do. It's about what he is. In classical theology, we hold to the doctrine of divine simplicity. God isn't made of parts. He doesn't have knowledge like you have a library book. He is his knowledge. He is his power.
So you can't subtract an attribute without subtracting God himself.
You can't have a part-time God. The infinite cannot become finite by subtraction. If you subtract anything from the infinite, it's no longer infinite. It's a logical contradiction.
So what's the alternative? How did the early church explain the emptying?
They looked to thinkers like Pope Leo the Great, whose famous tome was the basis for Chalcedon. He put it beautifully. He said, "The form of God did not do away with the form of a servant, nor does the form of a servant impair the form of God."
So it's not a zero-sum game.
Not at all. Leo and the whole Orthodox tradition argues that the incarnation is by addition, not subtraction. The Son added a human nature to himself. He didn't subtract his divine nature. He emptied himself of his glory and status, not his attributes. He veiled the glory, but he didn't delete the power.
But the source also points out a so what here? A failure of salvation. If the kenotic Jesus dies on the cross, who actually died?
A finite human being. If Jesus emptied himself of his divine power and infinite nature before he died, then the death on the cross is just the death of a really noble martyr, like Gandhi or Socrates maybe. But a finite death cannot pay an infinite debt. It cannot bridge that ontological gap between creator and creature. For the atonement to work, it has to be the death of the person who is God.
This sounds like a brain breaker, though. How do they solve the baby Jesus upholding the universe problem without stripping his divinity? It still feels like a contradiction.
The Orthodox answer is a doctrine that has a bit of a funny name. It's called the Extra Calvinisticum.
It sounds like a spell from Harry Potter.
It does, doesn't it? But it's a term associated with the Reformed tradition, though the idea goes all the way back to the Church Fathers. It refers to the extra, the idea that the Word is fully present in the flesh, but also fully present outside of it, upholding the cosmos.
So he's not confined to the body.
Think of it this way. If I stick my finger into a cup of water, my finger is fully present in the water. But the rest of me is still outside the cup, right? The Word entered humanity, but his divinity wasn't trapped inside the biological limits of the cells. He is locally present in the manger, but universally present as God.
That helps. It preserves the mystery without breaking the logic. But let's pivot. Kenosis tries to shrink God down. There's another move the source describes, which is redefining what divinity means altogether, functional Christology.
Yes, this is the great turn to the subject, and it really starts with Friedrich Schleiermacher in the 19th century. Schleiermacher is basically the father of liberal theology, and he looked at all this two natures, talk, substance, essence, person, and thought, this is just outdated Greek metaphysics. We don't think like this anymore.
So what was his solution? How do we talk about Jesus for the modern world?
He shifted the focus from being ontology to consciousness psychology. He argued that Jesus wasn't God in the sense of being made of divine substance. Instead, Jesus was a man who possessed perfect God consciousness.
God consciousness, meaning he was just super aware of God, like more than anyone else.
Exactly. The idea is that God's presence in Jesus was so powerful, so absolute, so unclouded by sin that it functioned as if God were there. Jesus is the man who is perfectly and completely dependent on God.
But wait a second. If I meditate really, really hard and I get super aware of God, am I God?
And that is the devastating critique. The source labels this as a new form of adoptionism. A man with a high awareness of God is still just a man. In this view, Jesus becomes homoousios, same substance with us, but not with the Father. It creates a difference of degree, not of kind.
So in theory, you or I could achieve this if we just tried hard enough.
In theory, it reduces Jesus to a super saint, the ultimate role model.
Right.
And this bleeds directly into what we now call spirit Christology. This is fascinating because it shows up in both very liberal academic circles and in modern charismatic movements.
That's a strange pair of bedfellows.
Very. The idea is to explain the incarnation not as the Word becoming flesh, but as the Spirit of God filling the human Jesus to a unique and definitive degree. They look at the baptism, the dove descending, and say, aha, that's the moment. That's when it happened.
So they would argue that Jesus did his miracles not because he was the eternal Son, but because he was anointed and empowered by the Spirit.
Yes. And you can see the appeal. It's huge. Preachers love to say, Jesus did miracles by the Spirit, and you have the same Spirit, so you can do the same miracles. It makes Jesus the ultimate model for the believer's life.
That does sound inspirational. So what's the danger? Where's the fence?
It's the Nestorian trap all over again. It violates ad aeretis without division. If you say Jesus is a man filled by the Spirit, you have two subjects, the man plus the Spirit. You've turned the incarnation into a possession or an indwelling, not a union of natures in one person.
It creates a distance again.
And it completely inverts the agency. In Orthodox Christology, the Son acts through his human nature. He is the driver of the vehicle. In Spirit Christology, the Spirit acts on the human Jesus. Jesus becomes a spirit bearer, a super prophet, rather than the incarnate Lord.
It seems like every time we try to fix the paradox to make it more applicable to us, we just end up breaking the engine that drives salvation.
That is the recurring theme of our source material. Tear down the fence, and the wolf gets in. And the wolves get much, much scarier when we move from these academic debates to the political and metaphysical extremes.
Okay, let's talk about the political side. Liberation theology.
Right. Now, we have to be very careful here, and the source is clear on this. The Bible is full of calls for justice. God absolutely cares about the poor and the oppressed.
Of course.
And liberation theologians like Gustavo Gutierrez or James Cone powerfully emphasize that God is on the side of the oppressed.
Which is true. But the source argues that when you make that the entirety of your Christology, you hit a pretty serious snag.
Right. The view tends to reconstruct Jesus primarily as a political revolutionary. The focus shifts from orthodoxy, which is right belief, to orthopraxy, which is right action. Jesus is the great liberator from systems of power, Rome, capitalism, systemic racism, you name it.
And the critique here isn't that Jesus doesn't care about those things.
Yeah.
The critique is about the Chalcedonian Defence of asynchros without confusion.
Correct. The source argues this risks confusing the kingdom of God with political liberation. It's what it calls the Eutychian risk in a new form. Just as Eutyches absorbed the human nature into the divine, liberation theology at its extreme risks absorbing the divine transcendent element into the purely human political struggle.
It collapses the horizon.
Exactly. If Jesus is only a political liberator, he can free us from Pharaoh, he can free us from Caesar. But the Chalcedonian Jesus is consubstantial with the Father so that he can free us from death itself. If you collapse the eternal into the temporal, you might get a revolution, but you lose the resurrection.
That's a powerful distinction. You need a Jesus who can do both. But if you lose the transcendent, you lose the ultimate victory. Now, Speaking of losing the plot, we have to talk about the JDS heresy. Jesus died spiritually.
This is a heavy one. It's found in pockets of the Word of Faith movement, and frankly, the source describes it as a grotesque deviation from orthodoxy.
Okay, walk us through it. The claim is that the cross wasn't enough.
That's the basic premise. They argue that physical death is just body stuff. To truly pay for sin, Jesus had to die spiritually. The claim is that on the cross, Jesus literally became sin, not just a sin offering, but that his very nature changed. He took on the nature of Satan.
Wait, hold on. His nature changed.
That is the teaching, that he was separated from the Father, dragged into hell by demons, tortured for 3 days, and then, and this is the real kicker, he had to be born again in hell to defeat Satan.
Okay, I need to take a breath. That is a lot. We went from "it is finished" on the cross to a blockbuster action movie in the underworld. From a Chalcedonian perspective, why is this considered such a severe heresy?
Because it completely obliterates the fences. First, and most obviously, it breaks a shashus without separation. The JDS view claims the Trinity was broken, that the Father turned his back on the Son in an ontological sense. But Chalcedon says the union is indissoluble. Even in the tomb, the body was united to the Word. Even in Hades, the soul was united to the Word. The Son never, ever stopped being God.
And the whole taking on the nature of Satan idea?
That violently violates a Traptus without change. God cannot change into a satanic nature. It's a metaphysical impossibility. God is light. In him, there is no darkness at all. To suggest the second person of the Trinity became demonic is, well, it's blasphemous logic.
And it seems to suggest that the blood wasn't enough. It really drifts toward Gnosticism, this idea that the physical body doesn't matter, only the spiritual transaction in some hidden realm matters.
Exactly. The Orthodox view is that the blood of Jesus saves precisely because it is the blood of the person of God. It didn't need to be supplemented by some kind of demonic torture.
Okay, we've covered the nature, the spirit, the politics, and the metaphysics. But there is one final frontier that modern thought is obsessed with: the mind. The psychological problem.
And this brings us right back to where we started. If Jesus is God, he knows everything, omniscient. But if he is human, he learns. The Bible itself says he grew in wisdom, and Jesus himself says, point blank, that he doesn't know the day or the hour of his return.
So how do you fit omniscience and ignorance in the same skull? It feels like a genuine contradiction.
Modern analytic theology tries to solve this with what they call the two minds theory. They use the analogy of the conscious and the subconscious.
Like Freud or something.
A little bit. The idea is that Jesus had a human mind, which was his conscious mind. It was genuinely limited. And he had a divine mind, which was sort of subconscious, and it knew everything. The divine mind only let information trickle up to the conscious human mind when it was needed.
That sounds plausible on the surface. It explains the not knowing without him having to pretend.
It does, but the source warns that this drifts dangerously toward psychological Nestorianism.
Two persons again.
Think about it. If the human mind doesn't know what the divine mind knows, if there are two distinct centers of consciousness that don't fully interpenetrate, is that one person? Or is it two people trapped in one body? It risks a kind of schizophrenic Jesus.
So is there a way forward? Or are we just stuck saying, it's a mystery, stop asking questions?
No, the source doesn't think so. It points to what it calls a neo-Chalcedonian retrieval. Theologians today, like Oliver Crisp and Kevin Van Hooser, are trying to use the old fences to build new, more dynamic models.
Let's look at Van Hooser's idea. Theodrama. I love that word. It sounds interesting.
It is compelling. Van Hooser suggests we move away from static philosophical terms like substance and think in terms of communicative agency. He uses an analogy. Think of an author entering his own play as a character.
Okay, so I'm picturing Shakespeare walking onto the stage in the middle of a performance of Hamlet.
Right. Now, does the character Shakespeare on stage know how the play ends?
Well, as the author, of course he does. But as the character in that specific scene, he has to play by the rules of the scene. He can only say his lines.
Exactly. The author, the eternal word, possesses all knowledge. But the character Jesus of Nazareth lives faithfully within the limits of the human narrative. He isn't faking the limitations. They are the genuine rules of the drama he chose to enter.
That makes the emptying make sense without losing the divinity. He's not subtracting attributes, he's defining his attributes through the story.
Yes, God shows his omnipotence not by crushing his enemies, but by having the power to endure the cross. It remythologizes the attributes in a beautiful way.
This leads us to the final and maybe the most important takeaway from the source material. It argues that Chalcedon isn't an instruction manual on the mechanics of the incarnation. like a blueprint of a cyborg, but rather it's a grammar.
This is the absolute key. We don't know the biology or the physics of the incarnation. Chalcedon is a grammar book. It tells us how we must speak about Jesus to be truthful to who he is.
Give me an example of this grammar in action.
It allows for something called the communicatio idiomatum, the communication of properties. Because the person is one, we can say shocking, paradoxical, but true things. We can say, God died on the cross.
Even though God, in his divine nature, cannot die.
Right. But the person who is God died according to his humanity. Or we can turn it around and say, the Jewish carpenter from Nazareth created the galaxies.
Because the person of that carpenter is the eternal word.
Exactly. But if you break the grammar, you lose the truth. If you say the human nature died, but not the person, that's Nestorianism. If you say the divine nature died, that's metaphysically impossible. You have to speak within the fences to describe the reality accurately.
So let's land this plane. We've thrown a lot of Greek, a lot of Latin, and a lot of heavy concepts around. Why should the listener, who maybe just wants to live a good life, care about these ancient fences?
Because ideas have consequences. And the source is adamant about this. When you tear down the fences to make Jesus easier to understand or more palatable, you always end up with a deficient savior.
If you take the kenotic route, the emptying route,
you get a sympathetic Jesus, a relatable one, but one who is ultimately too weak to save you. A fellow sufferer, perhaps, but not a victor.
And if you take the functional or spirit Christology route,
you get a Jesus who is a great example and inspiration, but he's just a Superman. He's not God with us. He's just a man who was very, very close to God. The gap remains.
And if you take the Nestorian or the JDS route,
you get a divided Christ or a mythical hero from an action movie. You lose the bridge entirely.
The bridge. That's the image that keeps coming back.
The ancient Holy Fathers weren't just being pedantic academics. They believed that this specific grammar, truly God and truly man, indivisibly, unconfusedly, unchangeably, inseparably, is the only thing that holds the bridge together. If that bridge breaks at any point, we are stuck on our side of the canyon.
And that leads to the final thought, the final challenge the source leaves us with. If Jesus isn't truly God and truly man indissolubly, if you take away any single piece of that Chalcedonian puzzle, is there any bridge left between us and the divine? Or are we just shouting across a void at a God who is either too far away to hear us, or a God who became so human he lost the power to pull us across?
That is the stakes of the question. Who do you say that I am? It's not just a question about him, it's a question about everything.
A question worth spending a lifetime answering. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the metaphysics of Christ. It's heavy lifting, but hopefully it makes the mystery a little more magnificent.
Keep asking the questions, it's worth it.
We'll see you on the next deep dive.